The iconic silver suit that made Robocop a legend nearly destroyed the film before it even started. From actors losing pounds of sweat daily to sitting in their underwear during car scenes, the armor that defined 1980s sci-fi was actually an intense dark green color that tortured its star, got him temporarily fired, and required a Japanese erotic art book to finally get right. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Robocop's armor. Fact 1. The suit was inspired by a Japanese sexy robot book. When Rob Bottin sat down to design the Robocop suit, he had no idea he was about to spend months creating what would become one of the most iconic costumes in science fiction history. Bottin, who had never designed a robot before, started by looking at everything from the stiff C-3PO costume in Star Wars to the robots in classic films like Metropolis from 1927 and The Day the Earth Stood Still from 1951. His first concept looked like a Marvel Comics superhero, which made sense since Bottin was a big comic book fan, but director Paul Verhoeven kept pushing him towards something more machine-like and less human. Over the next several months, Bottin created around 50 different designs, but Verhoeven rejected every single one of them, and the two even had a falling out over the constant criticism and changes. The design team was stuck and time was running out, but they had been given some very specific creative direction to work with. The suit needed to look heroic, it needed to represent the lineage of Detroit, and perhaps most surprisingly, it needed to be sexy. That last word turned out to be the key to everything. When the team heard sexy, someone pulled out a Japanese art book from 1983 called Sexy Robot by illustrator Hajime Sorayama. The book featured hyper-realistic paintings of feminine robots with smooth chrome surfaces and sleek, sensual curves that blurred the line between human and machine. Sorayama's work showed how metal could look both powerful and beautiful at the same time, with light reflecting off every surface in a way that made the robots seem almost alive. After combining Sorayama's chrome aesthetic with Peter Weller's body form in a final sketch, both Bottin and concept artist Miles Tevis knew immediately that this was the Robocop they had been searching for all along. The influence of those erotic robot paintings became the foundation for one of cinema's most recognizable designs, proving that sometimes inspiration comes from the most unexpected places. Fact 2. The armor is actually dark green. If you've ever watched Robocop and thought his armor looked like shiny steel or silver, you're not alone, but you'd actually be wrong about the color. The suits worn in the original 1987 film were painted an intense and surprisingly dark green, which is something that shocks most fans when they first learn about it. The reason almost nobody realizes this is because of how the suits were filmed and the type of lighting that was used on set during production. When the Robocop suits were shot under the natural fluorescent lights that were common in the 80s, something interesting happened with how the camera captured the color. The green paint, combined with the metallic flake and various purple, gold, and iridescent colors that were layered on top of it, created an optical illusion that made the suit appear to be a normal steel gray color to viewers watching the film. This wasn't an accident or a mistake. It was actually a deliberate choice by the filmmakers to create a specific look that would photograph well and seem more robotic and machine-like on camera. The people who worked on the film and saw the actual physical suits in person knew the truth, and over the years, photos of the original costumes have surfaced, showing just how green they really were. Prop makers and costume enthusiasts who have studied reference photos of the suits have confirmed that the base color is almost an aqua or teal shade of green, with highlights in blue, purple, and gold applied on top. The metallic look that audiences see in the finished film is basically an illusion created by the combination of paint, lighting, and how film stock captured those colors back in the 80s. By the time Robocop 2 came out in 1990, the suits were painted differently with blue over silver and different accent colors, giving them a lighter and more obviously blue appearance on screen. Fact 3. Peter Weller lost 3 pounds. Daily. Playing Robocop turned out to be one of the most physically demanding roles Peter Weller had ever taken on, and a big part of that had to do with just how unbearable the suit was to wear in the Texas heat. The production team decided to film Robocop in Dallas during the summer months of 1986, which meant that temperatures on set regularly climbed well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. When you combine that kind of extreme heat with a heavy costume made of fiberglass, foam rubber, and polyurethane that completely covered Weller's body, you end up with conditions that were almost impossible to work in for extended periods of time. The suit didn't allow any air to circulate around Weller's body, which meant that every bit of heat his body generated just stayed trapped inside the costume with nowhere to go. As a result, Weller was sweating constantly throughout each day of filming, and he later revealed that he was losing 3 pounds every single day just from water loss alone. Between takes, Weller's personal assistant Todd Trotter would rush over with electric fans to try and cool the actor down, and when they could find them, large ducts connected to freestanding air conditioning units were brought in to give him some relief. The cast and crew watched Weller suffer through this ordeal day after day, with co-star Kurtwood Smith later saying that even though he had his own complaints about working in the heat, seeing what Weller was going through made him feel lucky by comparison. Eventually, the production team realized they had to do something more permanent to help their lead actor survive the shoot, so they had a fan system built directly into the suit itself. This modification helped make things more bearable for Weller, but it didn't completely solve the problem, and he still had to endure brutal conditions for the remainder of filming. Fact 4. It took 11 hours to get into. The very first time Peter Weller put on the complete Robocop suit was a moment that should have been exciting, but instead it turned into a nightmare that lasted nearly half a day. Rob Bottin and his team of assistants spent close to 12 hours trying to get all 60 pieces of the costume properly attached to Weller's body, with each section needing to be carefully positioned and secured before they could move on to the next part. The process was incredibly slow and tedious because the suit had been designed with an internal harness of hooks and required every piece of the outer shell to be individually fitted, and nobody on the crew had really practiced doing this efficiently before the day they needed to start filming. What made this whole situation even worse for Weller was that he had spent months preparing for this role in a very specific way. Before production began, he had worked extensively with a mime coach named Mona Yakim to develop a unique movement style that would make Robocop seem both mechanical and fluid at the same time. Weller practiced for weeks to perfect these movements, imagining how he would walk, turn, and gesture as a cyborg police officer, and he felt confident that his training had prepared him to bring something special to the character. But once he was finally inside the actual suit, after those 12 grueling hours, Weller realized almost immediately that everything he had worked on was completely useless because the costume was far too heavy and restrictive to allow for any of those practiced movements. The actor later described falling into a state of depression when he understood that all his preparation had been for nothing and that he would have to start over from scratch to figure out how to perform while wearing this incredibly limiting suit. Co-star Nancy Allen remembered the difficulty of those early days, later saying that the crew literally had to put Peter together like a toy. Fact 5. Weller filmed car scenes in his underwear. One of the most amusing behind-the-scenes secrets from Robocop involves a problem that nobody anticipated during the design phase of the costume, and it had to do with getting the character into vehicles. The lower half of the Robocop suit was so bulky and rigid that Peter Weller simply could not fit inside a standard police car while wearing the complete costume, which created a real challenge since several scenes in the movie required Robocop to drive around Detroit or sit in a patrol vehicle. The production team had to come up with a creative solution that would allow them to film these scenes without building special oversized cars or completely redesigning the lower portion of the suit. Their answer was both practical and pretty funny when you think about it. Whenever a scene called for Robocop to be inside a car, Weller would only wear the top half of his costume, which included the chest plate, arms, gloves, and iconic helmet. Below the waist, he would just sit there in his regular underwear or boxer shorts, which gave him enough room to actually fit in the driver's seat and operate the vehicle. This meant that for a decent chunk of the filming schedule, Weller was essentially half Robocop and half regular guy in his underwear, creating what must have been a bizarre sight for anyone watching from outside the camera frame. The filmmakers were very careful about how they shot these car scenes to maintain the illusion that Robocop was wearing his full suit the entire time. If you pay close attention when watching the movie, you'll notice that most shots involving Robocop and police cars are framed to show him either getting out of the vehicle or preparing to get in, and the camera often focuses on his robotic feet exiting first to make it seem like he's wearing the complete costume throughout the scene. Fact 6. The helmet smelled terrible, so they used fiberglass. When Rob Bottin started building the Robocop suit, he made most of the armor pieces out of a material called polyurethane because it was strong enough to hold its shape while still being lighter than metal. The problem was that Bottin had never actually worked with polyurethane before, and he didn't realize until it was too late that this particular material came with some serious drawbacks that would make life miserable for anyone wearing it. Polyurethane has an absolutely terrible smell that gets even worse when you're working with it. And before you can even think about painting it, you have to prime the surface with toxic chemicals that create their own set of unpleasant fumes. Bottin quickly discovered that putting Peter Weller's head inside a polyurethane helmet would be like trapping him in a sealed box filled with chemical odors for hours at a time, which was obviously not going to work for an actor who already had to deal with extreme heat and physical discomfort from the rest of the costume. The helmet would be sitting right on Weller's head with very little ventilation, and those fumes would have nowhere to go except directly into his face, potentially making him sick or giving him constant headaches throughout the entire production. Bottin knew he had to find a different solution for the most important piece of the costume, the part that would be closest to Weller's nose and mouth for the longest periods of time. The answer turned out to be fiberglass, which didn't have the same awful smell as polyurethane and could still be molded into the sleek, distinctive shape that the helmet needed. By using fiberglass specifically for the helmet while keeping polyurethane for the other armor pieces that weren't as close to Weller's face, Bottin managed to spare the actor from one particular form of torture, even though plenty of other challenges remained with wearing the suit. Fact 7. Weller was fired, then rehired. The production of Robocop hit a major crisis point when tensions between Peter Weller and director Paul Verhoeven reached a breaking point, leading to a decision that almost ended Weller's involvement with the film completely. The main source of conflict was Weller's growing frustration with the costume and how it prevented him from performing the way he had planned. After spending months training with his mime coach to develop specific movements for the character, Weller found himself trapped in a suit that made all of that preparation impossible to use, and his disappointment and anger about this situation began to spill over into his interactions with the director. The arguments between Weller and Verhoeven became more frequent and more heated as filming continued, with the actors struggling to adapt to the limitations of the costume while the director pushed to keep the production moving forward on schedule. Things eventually got bad enough that producer Mike Medavoy made the dramatic decision to fire Peter Weller from the role and shut down production completely while they figured out what to do next. The crew was sent home, and the entire film was put on hold as the producers started looking at potential replacements who could step in and take over as Robocop for the remainder of filming. Actor Lance Henriksen was one of the names seriously considered as a replacement, but the production team quickly ran into a problem that made recasting nearly impossible. The Robocop suit had been custom-built specifically for Peter Weller's body measurements, with every piece designed to fit his exact proportions. Building an entirely new suit for a different actor would take months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars that the production simply didn't have. This reality forced everyone to reconsider the situation, and after Weller and Verhoeven agreed to shake hands and work through their differences, the actor was brought back and filming resumed. Fact 8. 50. Takes for a 1-second key catch. Sometimes the simplest actions in a movie can turn into the biggest nightmares during production, and Robocop had a perfect example of this with a scene that should have taken just a few minutes to film. There's a moment early in the movie where Robocop catches a set of car keys that are tossed to him, which sounds easy enough until you remember that Peter Weller was wearing thick foam rubber gloves as part of his costume. These gloves were designed to look robotic and mechanical on camera, but they had absolutely no grip and very little flexibility in the fingers, making it extremely difficult to catch or hold on to small objects. Every time someone threw the keys to Weller during filming, they would hit his foam rubber hand and immediately bounce right off, clattering to the ground while the cameras kept rolling. The production crew tried over and over again, adjusting the angle of the throw, changing how hard the keys were tossed, and having Weller position his hand in different ways. But nothing seemed to work. The foam material just didn't provide enough friction or control for Weller to successfully grab the keys in a way that looked natural and smooth on film. What makes this whole situation even more absurd is that the final shot only lasts about 1 second in the finished movie, but getting that single second of footage required the cast and crew to attempt the scene up to 50 times before they finally captured a usable take. The entire process ate up a full day of the filming schedule, which was a significant amount of time and money spent on what audiences would barely even notice when watching the film. The audio commentary on the movie specifically mentions this incident as one of the more frustrating technical challenges they faced, showing how even the smallest details of the Robocop costume created unexpected problems that nobody could have predicted ahead of time. Fact 9. The suit arrived 3 weeks late. The production schedule for Robocop was built around the assumption that Peter Weller would have plenty of time to practice wearing the costume and get comfortable moving around in it before cameras started rolling. But that plan completely fell apart due to delays in the suit's construction. Rob Bottin and his team had been working for months to build the costume, but the unprecedented complexity of the design meant that everything took longer than anyone had anticipated. The suit was supposed to be finished and delivered to the set with enough time for Weller to spend about a month rehearsing in it, learning how to walk, turn, sit down, and perform basic actions while wearing all that armor. Instead, the costume arrived exactly 3 weeks behind schedule, showing up on set on the very same day that the crew was supposed to film the first scene featuring Robocop in full armor. This timing couldn't have been worse for everyone involved, but especially for Peter Weller, who suddenly found himself in a position where he had zero opportunity to practice or prepare. The months he had spent training with his mime coach had been done while wearing regular clothes or at most a padded practice costume, which meant he had no real understanding of what the actual suit would feel like or how much it would restrict his movement. When Weller finally got into the completed costume for the first time, he discovered immediately that everything he thought he knew about playing the character was wrong because the suit simply wouldn't allow him to move the way he had planned. The lack of rehearsal time turned what should have been a gradual adjustment period into a crisis situation where Weller had to figure out an entirely new approach to the role while production was already underway and the clock was ticking on an expensive film shoot. Fact 10. 7 different suits were made. Building the Robocop costume wasn't just a matter of creating one suit and calling it done, because the filmmakers knew they would need multiple versions to handle all the different situations and scenes that the script called for throughout the movie. Rob Bottin and his team ended up manufacturing 7 complete Robocop suits in total for the first film, with each one serving a specific purpose based on what would be happening on screen. This might seem excessive, but when you consider all the wear and tear that the costumes would go through during months of filming, plus the special requirements for certain action sequences, it actually made perfect sense to have backups and specialized versions ready to go. One of the most important specialized suits was a fireproof version that was specifically built for the dangerous gas station explosion scene where Robocop walks through flames and igniting fuel. This particular costume had to be constructed with special fireproof fiberglass and other protective materials that could withstand direct exposure to fire without melting or catching a blaze, which was crucial for keeping the stunt performer inside safe during what was already a highly risky shot. The production couldn't take any chances with regular costume materials when someone's life was literally on the line. The production also needed multiple damaged suits that were pre-manufactured to show the aftermath of various assaults on Robocop throughout the film. These suits had battle damage built right into them, with dents, scratches, bullet holes, and other signs of wear that matched specific moments in the story. Creating these damaged versions ahead of time was much more efficient than trying to destroy and repair the same suit over and over again during filming. Having 7 different suits also meant that if one costume got damaged during shooting or needed repairs, the production could simply switch to another suit and keep filming without losing valuable time on set. Fact 11. All original suits were destroyed. After Robocop finished filming and became a massive hit, you might assume that the iconic costumes would be carefully preserved in a museum or kept safe in a studio warehouse somewhere. But the reality is much more surprising and kind of sad for fans who would have loved to see the original suits. Rob Bottin had an agreement with the studio that gave him 2 options for what to do with the costumes once production wrapped. He could either store them indefinitely at his own expense, or he could destroy them completely. Unfortunately, Bottin chose the latter option, and all of the original Robocop suits from the first film were systematically cut up into tiny pieces measuring just 5 inches square. This deliberate destruction meant that none of the actual costumes worn by Peter Weller during the filming of the 1987 movie still exist in their complete form today, which is a huge loss for film history and movie memorabilia collectors. The decision to destroy the suits rather than preserve them might seem wasteful now, but at the time, Bottin probably didn't realize just how iconic and beloved the Robocop design would become over the following decades. The costs and logistics of storing 7 bulky costumes indefinitely would have been significant, especially for someone working in special effects who likely had limited storage space already filled with props and materials from various projects. However, Bottin didn't get rid of everything related to Robocop from his personal collection. He kept 2 fully posed Robocop suits that were painted in the Robocop 2 style, and these were displayed in glass cases in his living room like pieces of art. These surviving suits weren't from the original 1987 film, but they still represented the iconic design that Bottin had worked so hard to create. Along with these suits, Bottin also managed to salvage a few smaller pieces, including the shoulder badge that Murphy wears when his arm is blown off during his death scene. Fact 12. Posse. The leg holster required. 3 operators. One of the coolest visual touches in Robocop is the moment when his gun holster automatically unfolds and pops out from a compartment built into his thigh, making it look like the character has this incredibly advanced mechanical system built right into his body. What audiences saw on screen looked seamless and futuristic, but creating that effect was actually far more complicated and required way more people than you might imagine. Rob Bottin designed and built this mechanical holster as a separate prop that was pulled from an original Robocop leg mold and constructed out of polyurethane, and getting it to work properly on camera turned into a surprisingly elaborate process. The holster mechanism operated in 2 distinct phases that had to be perfectly coordinated to look smooth and natural on film. In the first phase, the outer panel on the leg would open up and swing toward the back of the thigh, revealing the hidden compartment underneath. Then, in the second phase, the actual holster itself would be pushed outward on what's called a linear bearing, which is basically a sliding track that allows something to move in a straight line. Both of these movements were controlled by cables that were operated manually by crew members positioned just outside of the camera frame. The whole setup required 3 different operators working together at the same time to pull off the effect successfully, with each person responsible for controlling specific cables that triggered different parts of the mechanism. They had to time their actions perfectly so that the panel would open first and then the holster would extend at exactly the right moment, all while making it look like a single smooth automatic motion. The footage of the holster in action was shot as an insert during post-production, which means they filmed just the leg section by itself rather than having Peter Weller standing there in the full suit, making it easier to position the prop and hide the operators. Fact 13. The data spike was never connected to Weller. Robocop has a wicked-looking probe called the terminal strip that shoots out from his glove when he needs to interface with computers. And in the movie, it appears to spring directly from his clenched fist in a quick and violent motion. The effect looks incredibly cool on screen and seems like it must be some kind of mechanism built right into Peter Weller's costume glove, but the reality of how they achieved this shot was completely different and involved a prop that the actor never actually wore on his body at all. The production team created a standalone robotic hand specifically for these terminal strip scenes, and it was a much bigger and more elaborate piece of equipment than most viewers would ever guess. The prop itself was about 3 feet long from end to end, constructed out of fiberglass with jointed knuckles that were first cast from one of the regular glove molds used for the Robocop suit. The hand portion would normally have been attached to a ring that connected it to the lower arm on the full costume, but for this special prop, everything stopped at that ring with no arm attached beyond it. Above the ring, the effects team installed an open stainless steel frame that was equipped with powerful stainless steel springs designed to forcefully drive the probe outward when triggered, creating that dramatic snapping motion that makes the terminal strip look so dangerous and mechanical. Even though this whole contraption was about 3 feet long and fairly heavy, it was still light enough that one person could lift it and manipulate it without too much difficulty. Whenever a scene required the terminal strip to appear, an off-camera member of the special effects team would simply hold this fake hand close to Peter Weller's actual hand and operate the mechanism themselves at the right moment, with the camera framing the shot in a way that made it look like the probe was coming from the actor's real glove. Fact 14. The suit consisted of 60 individual pieces. The Robocop costume wasn't just a simple outfit that Peter Weller could slip into like a regular shirt and pants, but rather an incredibly complex assembly of separate components that all had to be attached to his body, one piece at a time. The complete suit was made up of approximately 60 individual pieces in total, which were divided between 2 main layers that worked together to create the final look. Understanding how these layers functioned helps explain why getting dressed as Robocop took so incredibly long and required a whole team of people to accomplish. The first layer was called the underskeleton, which was essentially a flexible bodysuit made from foam latex that covered most of Weller's actual body underneath all the hard armor. This underskeleton included pieces for the jaw, neck, gloves, abdomen, pelvis, and backside, and it was all painted black to look like cast iron or dark metal when visible between the armor plates. The foam latex material allowed Weller to bend and move while still maintaining the illusion that he had a robotic body, and it served as the foundation that everything else would be attached to during the suiting up process. The second layer consisted of the outer shell, which was made up of all the semi-rigid and completely rigid armor pieces constructed from polyurethane and fiberglass. These outer pieces covered the chest, limbs, and feet, and they were the parts that gave Robocop his distinctive metallic appearance and protected look. Each of these 60 pieces had to be individually positioned and secured to either the underskeleton or to Peter Weller's body directly, which meant the crew had to work methodically through every section from head to toe. The moving sections, like the limbs, were joined together using aluminum and ball bearings so they could pivot and bend, while the entire costume was supported by an internal harness made of hooks that helped distribute the weight and allowed for better movement during action scenes. Fact 15. a rejected design. Looked like vomit before Rob Bottin ever got involved with Robocop, the studio first approached a different special effects designer named Chris Wallace to take a crack at creating the iconic suit, and his version of the costume turned out to be so bad that it became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Wallace had just finished working on the 1986 horror film The Fly, where he created the grotesque and disturbing transformation effects that showed Jeff Goldblum's character gradually turning into a human-fly hybrid. Based on the strength of that work, which was incredibly detailed and won him an Academy Award, the studio thought Wallace would be perfect for designing a futuristic cyborg police officer. Unfortunately, whatever creative vision Wallace brought to The Fly didn't translate well to Robocop at all. And when he presented his initial design concept to the filmmakers, they were absolutely horrified by what they saw. The design apparently featured some kind of textured or organic-looking elements layered over a basic bodysuit, creating an appearance that was much more biological and messy than mechanical and sleek. Writer Edward Neumeier didn't hold back when describing his reaction to Wallace's design, saying it looked like someone threw up on a guy in a wetsuit, which is about as harsh a criticism as you can give to someone's creative work. That brutal assessment made it clear that Wallace's approach was completely wrong for what Robocop needed to be, and the studio immediately started looking for someone else who could deliver a costume that actually looked like advanced robotics rather than something disgusting and organic. This led them directly to Rob Bottin, who had just finished creating the incredible special effects for John Carpenter's The Thing in 1982. Bottin's background in creating mechanical and technological effects made him a much better fit for the project, even though he had never designed a robot character before and would go on to struggle with the assignment for months.